Welcome back to the Poetry of Night. Today, I wanted to focus on the poet Georg Trakl, who I introduced a little bit in the last episode by reading that poem of David St. John's, which is an homage to Trakl, which we will revisit today in order to hear not only some of the details from the poem that correspond to facts from his life, but even certain repeating words and his ability to create mood and a few other facets of that poem. Trakl was born in Salzburg, Austria, in the late 1880s, and he experienced aspects of both Catholicism and Protestantism as he was growing up. He was unusually attached to his sister Grete, who was also a pianist. It's speculated that he was actually in love with her. He didn't do that well in school, but he did eventually attend university and he became a pharmacist, which, among other things, facilitated his ability to continue with his long addictions. He joined the Austrian army in the early 1900s, did not adjust well to being released, though he got some writing done and saw some friends. So he returned, unfortunately, just during the onset of World War I in the medical corps, and he was assigned to treat over 90 soldiers ravaged by the Battle of Galicia and housed in a barn at Grodek, which is the name of one of his most famous poems of those that emerged from the horrors of war. And he actually witnessed one soldier committing suicide and watched others being hanged. His training as a pharmacist wasn't really enough to prepare him for the overwhelming situation he was dealing with as a medic. And it was so upsetting to him that he attempted suicide and failed, but was then hospitalized and later did succeed via an overdose, which it's speculated was conscious. Meanwhile, he had attracted the attention of Wittgenstein, who partially supported him, and a publisher, and Rilke. His poems continue to haunt and inspire poets and readers alike. I hesitate a little bit to dwell on Trakl's biography just because the facts might distract from the poems themselves, but they do feed the poems. So what I want to do now is return to For Georg Trakl, that poem by David St. John that I read in the last episode. And then I want to read Trakl's poem, Ellis, and I think you'll hear the real similarities between those poems. David St. John's poem again, For Georg Trakl. Your face, so pale now, it is blue, and in the icy, dead moons of your eyes, the things you loved are trembling, all utterly blue. The small, soft breasts of your sister, Vienna's night, alone. Frosted stairways, blue sonata, blue rosary of morning, blue sun. The river and the sleek angel stepping from its waters, offering a robe of woven larkspur. And the azure pearls of opium asleep in your palms, as if from the glazed balcony of your cheeks, blue tears had fallen. Now let's compare David St. John's poem to this poem by Trakl, Ellis. It's based on a Scandinavian folk figure who married at the age of 19 and then drowned in a well, but was somehow revived many years later. Mysteriously, Ellis had not aged at all, though his wife had continued to age naturally. This translation is by Stephen Tapscott. Ellis. Perfect the stillness of this golden day. Under ancient oaks you appear. Ellis, serene, with open eyes. Their blueness recalls the slumber of lovers. On your mouth, their rosy sighs fell silent. At evening, the fisherman drew in his heavy nets. A good shepherd leads his flock along the forest verge. How righteous, Ellis, are all your days. It descends so slowly, the olive's blue stillness, along the barren wall. The dark song of an old man dies away. A golden boat, your heart, Ellis, rocks in the solitary sky. 2. A soft carillon rings in Ellis' breast. At evening, as his head sinks back in the black pillow, a wild blue beast bleeds softly in the brambles. There a brown tree stands, secluded, its blue fruits dropped away. Signs and stars sink gently in the evening pond. Behind the hill, winter has arrived. Blue doves sip nightly at the icy sweat that drips down Ellis' crystal forehead. Constantly, it sounds along the black walls, God's lonely wind. So both of these poems begin as homages. They're in direct address. St. John to Trakl, Trakl to Ellis. Then in that second section of the Trakl poem, the figure of Ellis is spoken about rather than to. That second person address changes to third person observation. But in both cases, the imagination and observations are alive and vivid, almost as in extreme close-ups. If you compare that penultimate stanza of Ellis, blue doves sip nightly at the icy sweat that drips down Ellis' crystal forehead, to the St. John image of Trakl that ends his poem, as if from the glazed balcony of your cheeks, blue tears had fallen. There's an amazing resonance, I find, between those two. Look, too, at the really deeply unusual and incessant use of the word blue in both of these, and what it's applied to. In Trakl's poem, it appears 5 times in 30 lines, a repetition not as heavy proportionally as in those earlier poems I mentioned when we were talking about enchantment, but certainly enough to create a mood. In the St. John poem, blue appears 6 times in 17 lines, a higher proportion, and then it's amplified by other shades of blue, larkspur, azure. Even more unusual, look at what that adjective blue is applied to. In Trakl, eyes, an olive tree, a beast, fruits, doves. In St. John, a face, all the things you loved, sonata, rosary, sun, and tears. And then if we add in the azure and the larkspur, pearls of opium, an angel's robe as the angel steps from the water. Under certain conditions, of course, it's possible to imagine eyes or a face looking this way, blue. But as you start to think about applying that word to all of these other really unusual objects, this is part of, I think, the magic of Trakl that makes these poems so arresting and transporting. He seems to have a special relationship with color that trembles through all of his works, and I think it's part of what contributes to making these poems feel expressionistic or surreal, or relates them to the area of symbolism. In general, and especially in the use of color, I think what Trakl is doing is what Anne Carson, many years later, would talk about in her book, Autobiography of Red. As she puts it, what is an adjective? Nouns name the world. Verbs activate the names. Adjectives come from somewhere else. The word adjective, epitheton in Greek, is itself an adjective meaning placed on top, added, appended, imported, foreign. Adjectives seem fairly innocent additions, but look again. These small imported mechanisms are in charge of attaching everything in the world to its place in particularity. They are the latches of being. To go into this a little bit further, I want to quote from my essay, The Root of Saying, which first appeared in the Writer's Chronicle in 2004, and more recently has been reprinted online in Poemelian. Look again at the way color unexpectedly cracks open the way we would perceive so many of the things in this Trakl poem. Both day and boat are golden, both a pillow and walls are black, and it is not uncommon for Trakl to use color and other adjectives in this way Carson so many years later describes. The sun has set in black linen, says Trakl in his poem On the Way, which is redolent with autumn, with evening, with the random flickerings of life that occur as a stranger's body is carried to the morgue. How unlike simply the sun has set this is. It is wild enough to imagine the sun setting in linen, but Trakl has gone one step further and given us black linen. This creates, again, an entirely different image. And it also reminds me how prone I would have been to assigning white to the linen I was about to create in my head. As death and impermanence, autumn and war haunt poems of his like In Springtime, Downfall, In the East, Grodeck, and Nightly Surrender, we see that temples are green, night's forehead is shattered, eyebrows and mouths are broken, blood is a dark dew. Nouns are continually cracked open by the words surrounding them, and we're forced to modify the mental pictures we would have created otherwise. We're also surprised into a greater sense of alertness, alerted to what is vivid, even in its dying, its disfiguration. In addition, the proximity of these images is so close that very often in Trakl there's a sense of near synesthesia with what is heard and what is seen in such close succession that they almost feel unified in the way they're going to hit our perceptual apparatus. Here's another way that Trakl rearranges us, and it has to do with syntax. The order of the words arranges the order of our perceptions. This extends even sometimes into the way he arranges lines that we wouldn't expect. For example, listen to the first 4 lines of the poem De Profundis. I'm going to be reading you the Wright Bly translation from 1961. And De Profundis means basically from the depths, as in Psalm 130. It is a stubble field where a black rain is falling. It is a brown tree that stands alone. It is a hissing wind that encircles empty houses. How melancholy the evening is. Because we don't know what the it refers to in those first 3 lines, unless it refers back strictly to the title, From the Depths, roughly, what is the it? Then we get to the 4th line. Does the it refer to evening? Here, the question of what the it refers to in the first lines is maybe answered by this more obvious subject of the 4th. But imagine how differently this stanza would feel if those parts of it were reversed. How melancholy the evening is. It is a stubble field where a black rain is falling. It is a brown tree that stands alone. It is a hissing wind that encircles empty houses. In Trakl, instead of starting with what might be the answer to what the it is in those first three lines, he starts by giving us that succession of images and planting the question in our mind, what is this it? What does it refer to? To hear more of his unusual way with syntax, I'd like to compare two versions of the poem Summer. I first want to read the Wright-Bly translation from 1961 and then read Tapscott's version. My go-to always tends to be Bly-Wright, partly because the lyricism is so intense and mellow, but sometimes Tapscott's fidelity to the strangeness of the syntax is really interesting to hear. This is again the Bly-Wright translation. Summer. At evening, the complaint of the cuckoo grows still in the wood. The grain bends its head deeper, the red poppy. Darkening thunder drives over the hill. The old song of the cricket dies in the field. The leaves of the chestnut tree stir no more. Your clothes rustle on the winding stair. The candle gleams silently in the dark room. A silver hand puts the light out. Windless, starless night. And notice too how in each stanza our attention gets drawn to what is silent and what is audible. Here's the Tapscott translation, Summer. At evening, the cuckoo stops its crying in the woods. The wheat bends lower, the red poppy. A black storm threatens over the hill. The old song of the cricket fades in the field. Unmoving, the leaves of the chestnut. Along the spiral stairs, your dress rustles. Quietly, the candle glimmers in the dark room. A silver hand extinguishes it. Wind quiet, starless night. One of the moments where you can really hear the uniqueness of Trakl's order of perceptions is if you go to the last two lines of the third stanza in the German, and I'm going to try to approximate how that would sound. Auf der Wendeltreppe rauscht dein Kleid. Here, as in the Tapscott version, we're drawn to first the spiral staircase, the Wendeltreppe, which we notice a line later in Wright-Bly. In the German, on the next line, the sound, the rustle, comes even before we see the dress. If I wanted to stay faithful to the ordering of the German, I myself might take it a step further and end with, on the winding stairway, the rustle of your dress. So that, as in the German, the word order, the sound, what we hear, actually precedes what we see, but after first noticing the spiral stairway. This is still my favorite Trakl go-to, this 1961 translation of 20 poems of Georg Trakl by James Wright and Robert Bly. It sold originally for $1. I paid a lot more for this particular copy. And it was done 9 years after James Wright had sort of stumbled into the wrong classroom in a university in Vienna, where the professor, a Professor Susini, was reading these poems of Trakl in the twilight. I want to leave you today with some excerpts from the wonderful introductions that both James Wright and Robert Bly wrote as they led us into this little book of poems. This is from James Wright about Trakl. His poems are not objects to be used and then cast aside, but entrances to places where deep, silent labors go on. I believe that patience is the clue to the understanding of Trakl's poems. One does not so much read them as explore them. They are not objects which he constructed, but quiet places at the edge of a dark forest where one has to sit still for a long time and listen very carefully. In the poems which we have translated, there are frequent references to silence and speechlessness, but even where Trakl does not mention these conditions of the spirit by name, they exist as the very nourishment without which one cannot even enter his poems, much less understand them. And this is from Robert Bly's introduction. The poems of Georg Trakl have a magnificent silence in them. It is very rare that he himself talks. For the most part, he allows the images to speak for him. Most of the images, anyway, are images of silent things. Everywhere, there is the suggestion of this dark silence. The yellow flowers bend without words over the blue pond. The silence is the silence of things that could speak, but choose not to.